So this past weekend, I went on a road trip down to Arkansas to compete in a go-kart race. Now, for those of you that don't know, that's kind of how I got started in racing. So it was really neat to see a bunch of my friends and race on one of the tracks that I used to race on back in the day. But it really reminded me sort of the things that I like and the things that I don't like about go-kart racing. So with that in mind, now eventually I'm going to do a full video with some onboard footage from the race and all that stuff. It was a pretty crazy story. There was a fight, got launched through the air, all kinds of good stuff. But I'm gonna wait until I get the onboard camera shots from the race to do a full video on that. But in the meantime, I wanted to do this one, just kind of showing some of the video from when I used to race karts back in the day, and talk about the good things and the bad things about kart racing and kind of my opinions on where it stands as a way on how to get into motorsports. So let's start with what I consider the three main pros of kart racing as a way to get into racing. And the first and most obvious is that it's just way cheaper than any other form of racing out there that you could get into. I mean, I know there's things like enduro cars and stuff like that, but and of course this was in 2016, so the economy's changed a little bit since then. I put together a reasonably competitive kart that we were able to run up front with for about $900 at one point. Obviously, you can spend a lot more than that, and if you want to run up front in a really competitive class, you're going to spend quite a bit more than that. But it's still just so much cheaper than running a full-size car, and that carries over to some of the infrastructure that you need to be able to run it. For example, you don't need a full trailer. You could just throw the cart in the back of your truck and run out of a little toolbox, and you won't be the only one doing that. The number two thing that I would consider a major pro for a kart, especially for a beginner, is just how mechanically simple everything is. A kart has all the same basic functions as a full-size car, other than suspension, I suppose. But you still have steering geometry to worry about. You still have, your cross weight, your tire pressures. You still have an engine, a clutch, all that kind of stuff. But everything's just a lot smaller and simpler and easier to wrap your head around if you don't have the experience of racing in the past, and it's a good way to learn. All the skills that you learn as far as the mechanical skills and aptitude that you generate, whether it's working on engines or setup or what have you, that'll all carry over as you learn and transition into other forms of racing. And I would say probably the third biggest pro for a kart, especially for somebody that's getting started that's of a younger age, is just the fact that there is age classifications in kart racing. You have like a rookie class for like 5 to 9 year olds or something like that, and then you move on to like a junior class, and then of course like what I was doing, there's classes for adults as well. But if you have a kid that wants to get started in racing, it makes a lot more sense to start them off that way versus just there's a lot of stigmas against throwing kids straight into a full-size car when they're not even old enough to drive on the street yet. And so that may or may not be fair. Some kids probably are ready for it, but I think starting out in a kart kind of teaches the basics of racing and the responsibility and the sense of danger, if you will, that probably helps develop somebody mentally to be ready to run a big car. Now that kind of goes on to that, or builds into the cons that I want to list. And the first one is that there can be some issues with safety and driving standards at certain kart tracks. Obviously that goes for big cars too. You kind of got to find a good group to race with. But I experienced this in my trip down to Arkansas this past weekend, that just the driving standards were atrocious. And I think that really comes down to the fact that the karts can take a lot more punishment, which is a good thing. They're lighter and smaller. It's not going to necessarily tear you up or tear the other person up every time you make contact, like it would in like a modified or a sprint car or something. But that can lead to some over-aggressive driving, the bump and run being the norm rather than the exception. People driving you down through the infield. It doesn't always have to be that way, but I've found that at some tracks it is that way. So if you are getting into karts, maybe do some research, go watch some races at a particular track, and see if that's a group of guys that you want to race with. The second thing that I would consider a con or a limitation is that there are limits to how much you learn from a kart can be applied to a big car. Like I mentioned earlier, the major difference being that there's no suspension on a kart, so they drive obviously quite a bit different. And if you're racing, especially on slicks, things are going to be a lot different versus racing a big car. You can't drive a kart sideways on that kind of tire like you can with a big car, and that's kind of nationwide sort of the more preferred style of kart racing. If you're lucky enough to be in a region like down south where I race that they run on treaded tires that have a lot less grip, then you can slide the kart more and it reacts more like a big car. But you're still going to have a pretty big jump and have to unlearn some bad habits when you make that transition. And then finally, what I would consider maybe not the biggest con to racing karts, but certainly something to think about is that there really just isn't. It's not a part of the community like the big car tracks are. You don't see fans coming out to race. You're generally just racing in front of the other competitors and their parents or family and what have you. That can also make it, if you're the kind of person that wants to go out and find sponsors and generate revenue that way, you're going to have a lot harder time doing it in the karting world unless you're racing at a very, very high level. And even then, it just doesn't have the level of exposure that you see with the big cars. So overall, those were what I would consider the top three pros and cons of karts as it applies to getting into motorsports. Is it the best way to do it? I can't really answer that. That's a personal opinion, but it is absolutely the cheapest way to do it. And if you're looking for a way to get into racing, racing karts on dirt ovals is